This section, I think it'll be probably video number 5 in the series, is going to go through sections 10 through 12, the appraised value, infestation reports, and then surveys, title exams, and all that stuff. Starting out, the contract is going to be contingent upon the property being valued according to the lender's appraisal if they're getting a loan. So you don't have to do this if you're getting a loan, but I highly encourage you to check this box if you're getting a loan or if your buyer has a lot of cash laying around. Because if it doesn't appraise, it does not give your buyer an out if you do not check this. So if you were to check this, it's contingent on it appraising for appraised value. If the parties are made aware that the appraised value is less than the purchase price, the seller delivers notice to the buyer within 5 business days or closing, whichever is earliest, of an amendment to reduce the price. The parties agree to proceed to closing. So if you find out, bam, it didn't appraise, it's 10,000 under, then if the seller says, you know what, I'll come down to 10 grand, we're going to closing. Buyer does not have a chance to back out. But if the seller is aware and refuses to reduce the price, the buyer may proceed to closing or terminate the contract by delivering notice of termination to the seller, where earnest money will be returned to the buyer. Again, letting the buyer know what happens to their money. I would highly encourage you to make sure your client understands how this part works. It gives them another out, but there is a third option where the buyer can say, you know what, seller's not going to come down, I'll buy it, but the difference is the bank will only loan up to the appraised value. So if your house is $200,000 and you're getting a 100% loan and it comes in at 190, the buyer would then have to come out of pocket an extra 10 grand to make up that difference if the seller didn't come down. So that's why it's important to be contingent on appraisal. Of course, it looks a whole lot sexier to not be contingent on appraisal, but I don't think that's a good risk. And if your clients want to do that, let's have a discussion about it. You can check this box where it's non-contingent on the property being appraised to an appraised value. You can still do an appraisal, but it's not contingent on it, and you move on to the closing. The wood infestation report, also known as a CO 100, if the property is being sold has been previously occupied, this contract is contingent upon the buyer or the seller having the property inspected at their expense by a qualified licensed bonded pest control operator selected by the buyer or the seller, and delivery to closing of a CO 100 wood infestation report no earlier than 30 calendar days prior to closing and no later than blank calendar days prior to closing. So what this is saying, so CO 100 is only good for 30 days and then they expire. I don't know why. I guess termites can move faster than we think. So when you do a closing that is further out than 30 days, one, you have to decide who's going to pay for it. Well, if the seller already has a bond on the property, they might be willing to have their company come out and inspect it because it might not cost them anything. Now, what I would caution here is if they've had a bond with the company for 10 years and that company's a little slack and they haven't been marking everything properly, or there's been a little bit of damage, but they're kind of taking care of it, that might not be a good thing. I always recommend having the buyer do their own and pay for it. It's around $150, but is it independent, not sided with the seller, paid for by the buyer? I'd select them as well and do the infestation report. So here with the calendar days, it can't be within 30 days. It can't be outside of 30 days of closing, but I would also do it within 14 calendar days prior to closing. It's a an hour and a half maybe inspection, so it's not very hard to have done. But this is not during your repair procedure. That's why it's a separate column. So if the buyer is responsible for having the property inspected, as indicated above, but does not have the property timely inspected for the report's required delivery time frame, meaning if we put 14 days here, the buyer waives any and all rights on this section. The seller makes no warranties with regard to matters covered by infestation report or other improvements unless specifically stated in the contract. So let's talk about this. If the infestation report reveals a presence or an indication of damages by termites or other wood-destroying organisms, platypus beetles, carpenter ants, fungi, dry rot, whatever, the seller shall remedy such deficiencies and shall furnish the buyer with an infestation report by a qualified bonded pest control operator, dated no earlier than 30 calendar days prior to closing. Whatever. We'll move on from there. And then it has been treated and free of damage. State law regulations control CO 100 issues. Clemson Extension actually does it for the state. If the seller does not make the repairs and treatment, the buyer shall have the option to accept the property in its present condition, negotiate with the seller for the payment of the repairs and treatment, or terminate the contract. Now, not every loan requires a clean CL 100. Some do. If you check in here that there's going to be one, the lender's going to want to see it. So somebody might have to, if you do this and the lender requires it, somebody's going to have to make these repairs. And the seller says no, you can say, sure, fine, I'll do it. But most likely these repairs are going to have to be done prior to closing. So now you've got your client putting money into a house they don't own yet, which is never a good idea. So it then goes on to say if the property is sold, has not been previously occupied, the seller shall certify that the dwelling has been treated by soil poisoning, which is really bad. So if it's a brand new house, they have to treat the soil with the termiticide, and they give you that letter at closing. And it says the obligation of the seller under this section terminated closing as well. So if it's a brand new house, they have to treat it. It's part of the code process. If it's a resale, you can, to recap this section, you can ask for the seller to have it done and pay for it, or you can ask to be done and pay for it. VA loans require that the seller pay for the CL 100 for the buyer. It's really random. I'm not sure why, but you got to watch timelines on this one as well. And then lastly, which I think kind of plays into it, Section 12 is a survey of the title exam and elevation and insurance. So we recommend that the buyer have the property surveyed. It's really good to know what you're buying because you're buying land and real property. So it'd be really smart to know how much land you're buying. And we're telling them to get their title examined, which an attorney will do for them, and to get an elevation determined. So if it's in a floodplain or anything like that, you can get an elevation certificate, to determine if it's in the floodplain or not, and to get appropriate insurance. So this is us recommending that they get these done. And they need to make the insurance effective at closing. So unless we otherwise agree in writing, the buyer is to obtain new insurance policies by closing, and the seller may cancel existing insurance after closing. Ta-da! That's mind-boggling. Flood insurance, if required by a lender or at a buyer's option, shall be assigned to buyer with permission of a carrier and the premium prorated at closing. The buyers are solely responsible to investigate pricing, availability, coverage requirements, etc. for the property prior to signing the contract. That's true. However, sometimes things are in a floodplain that weren't in a floodplain before because they're redrawing the line. So it's up to us to get that examination done, or our client's examination done, and that's where the insurance carrier will say, well, you're in a floodplain now, and that might change things up. So that'll round us out for this section as well.